Hello, my name is Christian Griese, and in this tutorial I will show you how to create a Aurora Borealis effect in Houdini with either using my Aurora Borealis Asset or creating your own one. This tutorial is divided in a couple of sections. First, I will give you a quick overview so you can see if this is what you need or decide to go for something else. In the next section, I will go through every parameter in detail and also give you an idea of how to best use this asset, how to choose your settings. And I will onto that in the next couple of weeks because I'm also kind of new to this asset. Just finished it a couple of days ago. So I will probably post some presets and some additional information and ideas on the webpage, as well as some renderings. And in the last section, I will show you how I built this asset and give you a little insight into what problems I ran into and how I solved them, and a little bit of the philosophy of mine when I approach a problem like that. That's probably going to be most interesting for the student or in general people who are new to Houdini or to animating effects like this. It still needs some more advanced knowledge of Houdini. So I won't go into every single little detail. It's more general overview over the approach. So some things you should already know to be able to recreate it, but it will give you some good guideline. That being said, this asset will be for sale around the 23rd March 2021. I kind of decided to go both ways, offer you to buy this asset and save all the work, and probably that's the better option if you're working in production, but also for all the students, beginners and people who just want to try out something. There's the tutorial so you can put in the work and recreate it yourself. And probably learn quite a deal from it. And if you're a long-term old-school Houdini user, supervisor, and you watching this and you see some potential to improve the asset or some stuff that I could do better, I always want to learn something too, so feel free to write me with comments and critiques and also requests of what you would like to see in future versions of this. I forgot to mention, it will be available on Orbolt Store, so you can either search there or you just go to my webpage and you'll have all the links and everything connected to this asset right at your fingertips. A couple of strategic, maybe even philosophical ideas about this asset. If you compare this to an effect where, let's say, you have 200 warriors riding through the desert and they swipe up all that dust, that would be kind of an effect that has to be plausible, but it's much more in the background. It just integrates into the scene. But something like this Aurora will be an eye catcher. It will be something that has to be aesthetic because the moment it appears on screen, people will look at it because it's so mesmerizing and rare and you really don't see it a lot. So my main goal was to give control over the look and the animation and fine-tuned detail. Now there are two approaches. One would be to write a simulation that resembles the inner mechanics of a Aurora and has the looks as an outcome. And the other one would be to closely mimic the outcome with other methods. Now if you take something like rigid body simulation and you drop a massive rock and that rock hits the ground and it breaks apart, then usually you have a very tight connection to where you place the rock and the result. There's some variancy, but you know what it's going to look like. Now in this case, the source of the effect, the mechanics, the physical mechanics, are somewhere way out in the atmosphere, and they come from an interaction of the magnetic field and the solar winds and everything. And then 10,000 kilometers further, it creates the effect that you're able to see once it hits the atmosphere. So you have a very displaced connection between the cause and the effect. And it makes it very hard to direct it in any kind of way. So my approach was really to go in and try to mimic it and recreate it with different noises and functionality. Okay. To be able to art direct this, I built the effect in different stages, and I will go through those stages now so you see how you can go from focusing on one aspect to the other. This is an example of a Aurora that you've seen in the introduction video at the beginning. I just cut the part here off, and let's see how we done that. So the stages are that you take in some kind of input curve or line. We get to that. That line is then displaced by a function. And then there's a secondary displacement for the higher frequency noises. That gets then extruded into a band. First, there's just the geometry of that band. That band gets shaded, so there's some various noise functions that you can all control. And then you won't see anything now. It will take a little bit. So that band gets extruded into a point cloud. And that point cloud then feeds into a volume, and the volume is what you render out in the end. So again, the idea behind this is to focus on the different functions first. You create the movement, then you take care of how broad the Aurora is supposed to be, and then you go into the log and you switch between those different stages back and forth, because that way you still have some interactivity. I mean, you can flip book this, it will take about 2 minutes, and you can really change the look very fast. If you have a director sitting next to you or art director, he can exactly tell you, okay, I want it brighter in this area, I want it a little bit darker here, I want some brightness running down here, or I want an animation that comes in like this one. So there's all sorts of aspects that you can control. Okay, so let's go through the rest here. I'll switch to line primary. Here are some tessellations. I'll go through that in the detail. You have some shape settings. Here's a global modifier for all the noise functions, so you can scale things up and down. This is the extrusion, of course. There's a time shift function to slow things down or speed them up, or shift to a point where you think, oh, this is where the distribution looks best, and you want to start with that. You can use the time shift. There's a curve in and out to shorten your curve. That won't affect the noise functions, as you see. Base shape applies if you use a line input covered in the detail section later. And then there's the deformers. It's all based on a sinus function. You can set the wavelengths, you can set some offsets, shifting everything. You can set speeds, and then there's a distortion, distorting the sinus functions. Also some ramps to edit everything. You find those quite often, so I work with a lot of ramps that travel along the curve, so you can change different aspects at different points in the curve. That's the first sinus deformer, and then you can go to the secondary. And once you have your basic overall shape, you can add some various noise functions also. Yeah. After that, we go into the color settings, so I'll set this to band shaded. And I usually start like this, so I can just see how broad it is, switch this on and off and here's two brightness settings actually. One's supposed to set your maximum, and the other one you can use to fade it in and out during the scene, or you can do that in post as you like. The width global modifier, this sets how broad the Aurora is. We leave this at 4. I can also, by default, you have a ramp here. I have brightness settings along the curve. And of course, as with every ramp, you can animate this. I suggest for that you use the preview in the line stage, because it's much faster, much more interactive. And then you can better kind of compose the animations of different auroras in your scene. Okay. Then there's a side ramp, that's just the decline of the noise along the sides. You can also go crazy with this and create different bands, but usually there's an attribute for that. This is noise scale. Then there's a setting bands along the side, which you see here, which is really useful if you want to break the Aurora up and give it more interesting look. You can shift this. Let's say you want to have a gap in the middle here, creating like two different sections. You can offset this, go through the middle, and then different animation settings. And here's the amount of noise. If it's at 0, there's no noise at all, and the higher it gets, the more noise. At 0.5, it's usually good balance in the middle. If you go above that, you will have some islands left out, which is good if you want to have a very streaky look. I'll go through that later. So, hide color. I didn't use a color ramp because I want to be able to separate a couple of those values, which is what happens usually in nature. The red Aurora parts behave a little bit differently than the green and the blue ones, so that's what I wanted to mimic here. So you set the brightness first, and we can preview that with height gradient, which cuts out a middle section so it's faster. And then you can just switch here. And I probably forgot to put in the right gamma settings for the viewport, because those two look a little bit different when the fall off, and you should set this either to linear, which I would suggest, or to the same gamma of 2.2 on a Windows computer. And of course it's different on the Mac. So there's the ramp for the red channel, and the green one, and the blue one. And then there's some volume render settings. I can set the voxel size. I can introduce blurring only on the volume. We won't see it in the preview here. Either global blurring or blurring that travels along the curve. And I can also blur with height, so you have some sharper features on the lower side, and then it blurs out to the top. There's an atmospheric noise option that introduces some noise, and it's also not in preview, it's on the volume. So it gets dimmed a little bit because you have different densities of air and molecules in the atmosphere. And then there's a caching function. Usually I cache after this band's shaded stage, but there's also an export option for the file in volume, which will be huge. It will be around 1 gigabyte or more. So usually if you're using tops, and if you want to create, let's say, a contact sheet with 50 different errors or anything similar, you should use this option and just cache in between, and then read in the one you want to use using this setting. And yeah. There's one toggle here for show standard parameters. I try to keep this a little bit more lightweight while you're interacting with the Aurora, and you don't need those settings that often, but here's your usual transforms, renders, miscanals, and everything. If you display this actually in a render, there's a setting use custom material. Usually it will use a built-in material network, and if you want to use a different one, you can reference this here. Okay, so let's go through everything in detail. First of all, let me go to this input remeshed. We have three different options of what to use as our source. First, there's a line, which just creates a simple line. So you can set the origin, direction, and length here, and like make this a little bit longer. So it's about the size of the curve, and yes. So if I use this one, you see that the settings get transferred pretty straightforward, and also the animation. The second option is the user curve, which takes in any curve that in this case has to be an open curve, or you will get trouble and glitches. And the third option is Discrete Fourier. Yeah, let's do it like this. I have a test geometry, which is okay. Give me a second, I need to create a copy or this won't work. Okay, and then I just erase some of those settings. Or let's just go to input remeshed. So yeah. By the way, if you hear weird noises in the background, it's either my cat or my 6-month-old son. So don't get worried, no one's dying here. And what Discrete Fourier does, it analyzes the geometry and splits it in different epicycles that represent frequencies, and then you can go and shift those epicycles. Delete this one, and this is not looking too good right now, but with the proper settings you can actually deform the geometry on many different levels, and I'll get through the details here later because this is a little bit more advanced. So let's go back to our user curve. So this sets the intersections along the curve, and this value should usually be lower or equal to your voxel size once you go into rendering. High tessellation, I suggest you go between 100 and 300 depending on how high your Aurora is. And then the side sections, which will be of course this direction, and that depends on how broad your Aurora is. What I usually do, I start with the default values. I create a little cross section here with the curve node, and then so let's see, and we can see there's some parts here that seem problematic, so let's lower this to 15. And I increased the resolution even further also on the volume tab. And there's still some, those are mostly from the noise, so this looks good. So usually I try to carve out sections when I go into look development, and then I go back to the rest. And for the purpose of this video, I probably should leave this around 10. And then I'll take a quick look at the band stage to see how many side sections I will probably need. Yeah. This is if you have any areas, and that's important, if you have any areas with very sharp corners, you can't get into trouble once you extrude the curve, because they will, parts of the curve will intersect parts of that band. And this can help to smooth things out a little bit. Also isolate center threshold. This will delete anything beyond that fraction of the curve in this direction. So once you go to the height gradient, if you increase this value, you will broaden that section that gets cut out, and that of course will make everything slower shape. So we already talked about the global feature size, so that's a multiplier on all the noise functions and also on the width. So if I go here, geometry, it makes everything smaller or larger, and it's very good. If you have different scene sizes, you can adapt to them pretty quickly, or of course you can use the transform parameter. So let's stick with this one for now. And so extrusion, as I said, is the extrusion in the y-axis. Time shifts to a point where you think the Aurora looks best. It doesn't affect any animated parameters. It only affects all the noise parameters. But it's pretty good if you have some noise on your band geometry later on and you want to go to a stage where it looks best to you. You can go through this. Of course it's running a little slow, so as long as we're not rendering, let's stick to those settings. And yeah, so you can search your perfect point and you see there's a lot of characteristics that appear and then vanish again. So it's a good idea to just create your basic settings and then run through this until you're really happy with the result. And of course we should do this on the stage where it is fully, time scale slows things down. I usually start fast so I get an idea of what the dynamic looks like, because if it works when it's fast, it will work when it's slower. But if it doesn't work when it's fast, you will get some parts that just look off and you really need an organic look. So you should start with a fast version probably. And okay, curve we already used. Base shape, as we showed earlier. Use height noise, we'll get to that later. So how is this working? Let's switch here for a second, just to have only the primary noise. And let's lower this to 0. So what we basically have is a sinus curve, and we can set different settings for that curve, set an offset, set the speed, how fast it's running away from the center here in this case, or towards it. And let's take a negative speed, so we're going towards the center. And then we use the values, the U values along the curve, and we distort those with a anti-aliased noise. And then that noise is what introduces kind of the variance and that fractalized look of a sinus curve. But because we apply it to a sinus curve, the overall amplitude will kind of stay the same, and it gets a much more naturalistic look than just applying a noise for itself. And as you see, I'm just playing around with the values a little bit. It's usually a good idea to crank up the strength to about 3/4 first, and to get some really clear noise, and then play with the frequencies, which depend on the frequencies of the sinus curve itself. And if you're happy with the result, you lower the amplitude, and then you should get some nice shape. And it's good to set some overall value first, and then later when you through the band stage, you might go back here as soon as you know how broad the Aurora is, and tweak those values a little bit more. And it's a good idea to try out some negative values for the speed, so the sinus curve and the noise run in opposite directions, which always creates a bit more interesting look, as I think. We can set some roughness here. And then we have two kinds of motion. We have a parametric motion, and that goes for most of the noises I use. We have one that creates kind of a wavy flowing motion, and that's this one. So let's set the other one to 0 first. So this one is running along the curve very fast in this case. So let's lower the speed a little bit. So it creates this flowing notion to it. And that's something that you see in natural Auroras for a part. But then you also need kind of a motion that goes a little bit jittery back and forth, and that would be this one. So this noise, probably good value. This noise passes through the line, a little bit like if you imagine you're in a club and there's a laser running through smoke, and the same way the noise runs through the line, and that creates a little back and forth motion, little jittery look. So if we increase this value, you see there's no flow to it. It's entirely random. And if you use it subtly, it introduces kind of an unpredictability to the look. The second sinus deformer, and let's switch this on, is usually much higher frequencies. Internally, this one is calculated a little bit differently. While the first one is directly offset on the curve, the second one gets stored inside the curve and gets applied after we go into this bend stage. Why is that? Because every time you have a turn, you tend to get overlaps. And in some cases, you might want to go and introduce some high frequency noise in the first deformer. And because the first deformer doesn't have this feature of applying the deformation afterwards, you will run into trouble. So the first one is really just for the overall shape, and if you need some high frequency detail, you should always go with the second one. That's just as a side note. So yeah, this one works exactly the same way. We can set wavelengths, and the wavelength is connected to the one of the first. So the relationship between the higher and lower frequency stays the same. There's also an offset, and then you gotta play around with the values until you have the look that you like. So let's see what we got in this case. It's not the best result yet. There's some tweaking to do, but I'll leave that for now. Base color. First of all, there's one brightness thing attribute here, which is the preview gain. Once you go into the volume stage, your brightness will depend on the angle that you look at the Aurora because of the overlap. It will depend on the width of the Aurora band, on resolution, a lot of other parameters. So that's why I decided to split like the preview brightness and the render brightness, and you first go, the first time you go and set your render brightness, you can go back to this parameter and just tweak your scene preview accordingly. And also if you already animated the scene and it's very dim, you can brighten it up just to have a look at the details again. Let's go over to color. This affects rendering, so usually volume gain is for setting your maximum brightness, and then you use this upper value as an example to fade in and out during the animation. Global width multiplier we already shown. Then you have this ramp, and we should go into this stage now. Let's go to shaded. And yeah, and this stage can really set the character of your Aurora. You can start with a very thin line and then just broaden it out and then break it up kind of like this, and that way you get interesting shapes. And the more complex it looks, the more difficult it is to spot things that don't make sense or wouldn't be there in nature. So you should try to get some variance in here. Then we have this toggle, that's very important. So if I make this more narrow here, you see it gets a little bit brighter. So in nature you have a certain amount of radiation coming in, and then depending on the magnetic field, that radiation can spread out over a larger area. So your brightness per area would get lower the broader the aurora is. And also if you look perpendicular through it, the brightness will accumulate, and if you don't compensate for the broadness, it will definitely burn out in some areas, and that's why you should leave this on. And without that, you see those areas get much brighter. You should use this in general. Intensity along curve is pretty much self-explaining, and the two values on top of this tab are multipliers on this. One good practice is to let it fade out in the end, because the curve, if it's extruded, suddenly stops there, so that will look odd. And if you're animating this, which I think you should do, so usually if I use it, I use the multiplier to fade it in and out. Then I create 2 or 3 valleys and mountains, not much more in the beginning, and then I shift those around a little bit throughout the process, so I get some more motion into it. And if I decide that I need finer control, I will add that on top of it. And usually if you just add 1 or 2 values in between, then they will kind of be in offset key set by Houdini automatically, so that's much easier than starting with, let's say, 10 values and then trying to shift those around all the time, which can get pretty messy after a while. Luminance ramp red. So I already mentioned that I treat the various color channels differently, because they have some variations in the way they are created. Without getting into much detail, what happens in the atmosphere is you have this high energy radiation coming in, and it hits molecules in the atmosphere, and it kind of puts them into a higher state, which has to do with the orbits of the electrons. And after a while, that molecule comes back from that higher state by releasing energy in the form of photons, which is the light you can see. Now there's some differences between the various types of light emitted and the way they are emitted, and that's basically the time and the position in the atmosphere. Now, the molecules that usually get activated in the higher parts of the atmosphere take about a minute until they re-emit light, and that light is in the red spectrum, so we see it as red fractions of the aurora. And because the conditions for that are much rarer to find. You don't see those red parts that often, and they're not that evenly distributed and cover as much of an area as the bluish or greener parts which you find in the lower atmosphere. And they're a little bit more biased towards the green side, so that's why I have the green and the blue channel, and we treat them also a little bit differently. And what's interesting is if you have a fast moving aurora, that the red parts are usually offset because of the time difference. The lower parts, they release the light almost immediately after about a second, while the other one takes a minute. So you have the time offset of a minute, and it's almost like you're looking a little bit into the past with the animation. Now I decided to not incorporate this directly. What I suggest you do is that you take the time offset, you create 2 copies of the aurora, and then you just use a time shift on one of the copies and you render that red channel individually, because if I would have done it directly in the asset, I would have basically 2 streams of volumes that would have to be combined internally, and that would kind of overload the whole thing. So we have a switch to create them only in some parts, and that's this one. And if I switch that off, you will have the red parts almost everywhere. And I recommend, once you're through the first stage of look development, you turn this on and find the right spots where you want to place the red parts, if at all. Now let's go to the side ramp. This is the drop off of the brightness along the sides. Higher values mean darker aurora. And if we take a closer look at the geometry, then we see that the density of the intersections is much bigger on the borders, and it's because we have the highest drop off there. And so wherever you have a sudden change of brightness, because we voxelize this, the chances of aliasing is much bigger, so we compensate for that by increasing the geometry density here. And then there's the interesting part. So here's the noise scale, and usually if you create noise like this, it will look very jaggy and streaky. It's usually a good idea to start with something that's more stretched out. Probably, yeah, like this. And also I have turbulence settings here. So those are the layers of the noise. And if you want a smooth aurora and something more diffuse and more broad stretched out, you should go with 2 or 3. And if you want to have a streaky look and everything being a bit more broken up and rougher, you can go with 4 or 5. I'll leave this at 4 for now. This one we already talked about, so that's creating this broken up look. And if you shift this around, you can probably get some interesting results. Now those parts I can take care of by just lowering the noise in that area, and that would be around here. Yeah, so that way you can dial it back in. And as I said earlier, if you increase those values a lot, you get a much more broken up look. But in order to get that, you actually need to lower the frequency here. So what you can do is you can create something more smooth and soft with lower frequencies, and then create some high frequency on top of that, and that way you get your streaky look. If you're going for that, you compose those 2 together, and then it gets more sparkling and a bit more magical. And probably it's a good idea to lower the width for that Yeah, something like this. We'll stick with the higher bandwidth. We stick with this for now. And let's get rid of the intensity here, just to kind of see everything. And there we go. Okay. We have the same settings here. We have one noise that passes through everything. And it's this. And this will make it a bit more vivid and mystical. And this one is a good setting to travel along the curve and create some organic, coherent look. It's a bit more aesthetic. Okay. Height column. We should go to this stage. Height gradient. Yeah. So we have our brightness settings here. And of course you can always make this sharper. Let's go to 5 maybe. Oh, grab 2 of them. And 20. Yeah. So yeah. It's no biggie. That's where you go into your look development. And I usually fade in a little bit of red, even at the lower fractions, and then that's it. Volume render, voxel size, we talked about this already. If you use blur, it blurs everything out. You gotta turn this on if you want to turn the other one on, and you shouldn't leave this at 0. Probably if you're only using blur, because then you get some problems with the volume padding. So if you have 0, turn this off. This blurs along the curve, this blurs along the length, and this blurs with the height. So this sets the point where the blur sets in, and this is where the blur has its highest value. And this is probably way too high. Yeah, then there's the atmospheric noise. And I already shown the caching. So just to repeat a couple of best practices. First of all, try to build it up from the first stages up to the band shaded result, and then go to the height gradient. Play around a little bit with it, how kind of the look here translates to the volume, and it's really good idea to use the carving and just carve out the part that you want to focus on. In this case, let's say we want to focus on this broken up area here. Then you go to the rendering, see what it looks like, and then you go back and tweak your values. And if you want to fade it in and out, it's a good idea to first start with line secondary and then create your intensities. Especially if you have different Auroras in place, you can always go in and just have some interaction between them to see what they look like. I'm going to show you one quick example. So the animation that you've seen at the beginning was kind of created like this. So I just took different line setups, and I started with something like this, and then went through the different stages, kind of selecting everything at once. But first of all, having this very fast interaction just with the lines, and kind of creating that look, and then building up from there. And of course, because it's very big volumes, rendering those out individually and comping them in Nuke. Now, one last word of advice. if you're animating the input geometry, you have to be aware that it gets transferred into a UV space. So if something stretches, if the overall length of your input geometry changes, then also the points on the curve will change with it, the UV values. And that means like the more you animate the curve, the more the sinus curves and everything will travel or stretch out, and you'll get some change. So an animation, the speed of the animation will trigger the speed of the changes in the Aurora by some degree. This has been a lot of information for just as a tutorial how to use the asset, and we're not even getting to the how to build it part, but I hope it's worth it if you use this in a production for a hero effect. As I mentioned earlier, just let me know. And also just want to shortly mention that I'm working on a book called Thinking in CG, which puts together psychological concepts of creativity and abstraction, and it's meant as some guiding book how to figure out problems like this and how to get from very complex and scientific topics to a level where you can tackle a problem in a artistic fashion. So if you're interested in that, write me a mail. I'll keep you posted once the book is out, or you just come back every now and then and look at my page. There will be new tutorials, new insights, and if anyone wants to correct for future projects, feel free to do so. I would be really happy to work with you. Now let's get to the next chapter, how to put it all together yourself. I should open this up so it's not grayed out. Yeah, looks much better. So as you see, it's quite a big asset, and I took a lot of time to comment everything out. So probably by the end of this video, I'll just browse through all the comments just so you can read those things. And you already have an idea how to work with this asset, so that would make things much easier. So in this case, let's switch this to the line setup. And here I have just my input geometry, and I do a couple of conversions to that. I won't be going into the Discrete Fourier for now, and I'll probably create a second video on that one because it's a bit more complicated. So first of all, I resample my geometry, make this larger. Okay, this should work much better. So yeah, this is just resampling the geometry. This one is for later use because I want to upgrade this in the next version to kind of create scattered curves around the center curve. I should disable this for now. So I create the gradients for the points. And I use this two energy attributes that kind of placeholder for the brightness. I have a blur attribute that already right in the curve, so I can distribute it evenly even if I have this band-like geometry, and also preview the brightness settings with converting it to color. I set a couple of global attributes and master attributes, global blur, primitive master, and everything that gets written into the points. So if you check here, you have all those attributes present. And then I have a switch which will introduce this ramp for the red channel luminance. Then I generate UVs from that, because I use those, and I regenerate the UVs quite often after the distortions. So because if I have a sinus curve, everything gets stretched a little bit, and I want to make sure that I stay with more even distribution. I use a measure sub because I want to normalize some values to the length of the curve. I promote the measured area to the length of the curve, and then I calculate the length like this. And let's go to the okay, that doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. So yeah, try to recreate the scene as close as possible. So yeah, polyframe, it just creates a tangent, I calculate cross vector, and then I kind of get a normal from the curve outwards and two-dimensional layer. Then I have primary distortions and ramp distortions. I was running into some problems while trying to create a switch inside the VOPs, which, as far as I remember, I'm not supposed to do anyway, so I did it with an external one. And this is getting a bit more complex, so let's go into the VOP network. So what do? First of all, I pick up time and UV space, and I extract, and this is probably older version. So I extract the attributed ones along with the curve, and I compensate the length. So I stay in the same value from 0 to 1. Here's some parameters for frequencies, some constants to kind of balance it all out. So when I use the default values, I already get good settings, and I feed this into flow noise position. And then I have a offset, and I use this pass-through motion to create the offset. So the noise along motion, that one kind of goes with time and also an offset, and it kind of pushes the noise along the U attribute, so along the curve, and the other one creates the offset in another dimension that goes through the curve. So then there's roughness parameters and everything. And then I create a sinus curve from the U attribute. And I use the noise to offset the U attribute on the sinus curve. Yeah. And here's also motion attribute that gets also added. So with time I increase the U attribute so the sinus curve runs along. Then there's deform along side vector. So that's my normal that I calculated earlier, and that gets applied to the noise and to the point positions. So I get my final point positions and have everything displaced. And here with the ramped one, I just have a ramp to multiply with the distortion to lower and increase the distortion. Then there's a resample. Because with the distortions I actually pull areas apart or get them tighter together. So I need to resample the curve. I regenerate my UVs. I recalculate my positions, and then there's another polyframe for the tangent, another cross vector to get my new normals, and those nodes will smooth high curvature areas out if you have geometry problems there. So there's a measure sub to actually measure the curvature, and everything below the threshold gets put into a group. I smooth it out. And also there's a visualization to actually see what's happening here, and I need to click here. So, and there's no flashing red areas, but if I increase this for a second, shape, let's take the second, well, let's take the first one actually. Wavelengths, and put it really low and put it really high. And let's see, yeah, and then you see it marks those areas that will be quite problematic. So this is actually a good place to stop for a second and tell you a couple of things about how I work with creating effects like this. And I think if you go away from just creating an asset that creates a certain effect and go a little bit, take in a couple of ideas about creative process and problem solving, things get much easier. So what I usually do is when I have a phenomenon, a natural phenomenon that I want to imitate, then I first try to find tools and algorithms that are suited to imitate that phenomenon. And then I go and try to find technical obstacles, and they deal with converting different geometry types, handling data, solving intersections, and such. Anything that would interfere with the first point, the imitation, and introduce problems there, like unwanted noise or glitches and everything. Then I go towards the art direction. So I find the most practical points of interaction. In this case, it's like frequencies, brightnesses, the offsets and everything. So anything an art director would want to go in and have control over. And then the fourth stage is performance optimization. So I try to find any tools in the toolset of Houdini or any other software that I can dock in, because Houdini is still my main package and will hopefully be for a long time, and make the interaction faster. And in that case, that's creating this kind of 2D curve as a basis for the effect, because that displays in real time, and from there you can go into the 3D effect, and that's actually what creates a flow in the interaction. If you're interested in what flow means, I will post a talk about flow in the coming weeks on my channel. And also performance optimization, of course, is anything that speeds up rendering, or if you have a simulation, the simulation itself. And you can actually watch those kinds of steps while technology involves. I mean, once new tools get introduced in Houdini, you kind of have that thing, okay, it can imitate the phenomenon, but there's still some trouble to it, and then people find ways around kind of the technical hindrances, and then everything goes more and more towards art direction, making things faster, increasing interaction. You see it with pyro tools, you see it with the terrain tools, and also with USD and everything makes, the handling of data much easier, and then comes performance optimization, of course. And I have the impression that a lot of TDs or people in R&D kind of use that intuitively. It's a bit similar to what you do in Scrum. If you're not familiar with the term, Scrum is a method in agile development. One of the aspects of Scrum is that you create kind of a backlog, which is a list of all the features that you want to have in a program or in a asset, and you prioritize those features and say like, okay, what's the most important one? And then you take a certain span of time. Let's say in games development, it would be 2 weeks or 4 weeks, and you measure how much time do I have. Maybe I have like, okay, it's 2 weeks, I have 80 hours or 100 hours if you tend to work overtime, and then you say like, okay, the first feature, how long does it take? It's maybe 20 hours. The second one is that many hours, and you just go down the list and try to see how much can I pack into one of those iterations, and then you take the result. In the end, you take a look at it, you see if you want to change something, and then you go into the next cycle. But the idea is to not go and plan every little detail in advance, and you have 80% of the development time over, and then you start scripting, as people used to do in the 80s and 90s a lot. But as soon as possible, go and get an idea of the result, see whether your approach is working. And what I do is I try to divide the asset into certain modules, like sub-modules, sub-areas, and they all have a very clear in and output. And usually we tend to look at the outputs a lot, but I think also the inputs are important, because you gotta have an idea of what information has to feed into my module. And I develop it a little bit like a black box. So first of all, I create those nulls, those crosswise nulls, and I say like, okay, I have this area that's going to give me that result, I have another, and then I just create a network out of those nulls, and then I go to the area that's most interesting to me. And if I don't have a script yet or a clear method how to create the previous parameters and geometries and everything by scripts, sometimes I go in and I create kind of a dummy geometry that I can work with by hand, just so I have something where I can kind of do my proof of concept of the most important method that I have. And in this case, I kind of I didn't create too much parameters by scripts. I just created like a dummy geometry of a line, and then I first of all tested after a certain time how that extrusion into volume works, and then I kind of went back and created all the parameters, all the helping tools leading up to that afterwards. But I had, very soon an idea, okay, this approach is gonna work. Now I'll go into the details. And so between all those areas, I tried to sort them out, give a clear overview, okay, what section does what, and then I have those pickup points where the next one kind of picks up the geometry. And then I have those circles in orange, and that's usually for previews, so I kind of put them as side chains. Sometimes I attach visualizers to them, and that's how I tackle the problem and build from there. Yeah. Okay, so let's go on. And then okay, this one is just for the backlog. We'll ignore it for now because it's empty. So those two nodes are basically what we had with the first displacement. One is with a ramp multiplier and one is without. And if we dive inside, we see that this time the values don't get stored into the position but into a custom attribute. And other than that, it's basically the same as the previous one. And next I delete a couple of attributes to keep everything nice and clean. And then every now and then I have those side chains running out to the previews. And one thing that's important is because I store a lot of attribute and apply them later on in those side chains, I have to apply them directly, like this displace vector and also the carving, because that would mess up my UVs if I would put it right into the main chain. As you can see here, it goes on with UV recalculation, and we have the main chain carving afterwards. And then I use a polywire. I use a polywire because, if I scale the y-axis and I delete the lower part of the polywire, let's just preview that. So yeah, that's what it looks like. And I found out I used extrudes before, and I found out that I want to have a higher resolution at the borders because the steepest brightness gradient is usually in that area, and if you don't have enough voxel resolution, you tend to get aliasing. And to have a high resolution just in those areas keeps the poly count overall low and still gives you a good compensation for aliasing. Okay, I promote my UV attributes. Let's just view the settings here for a second so you can copy them. So I multiply the width with global feature size, and this is just a constant to bring it to a good value. Then divisions, those are my side sections, and segment scales. And this parameter helps with problems in very curvy areas, and in some cases it's not really necessary, but I didn't want to promote every attribute on top of the asset, so I just leave this on for default. And if you reproduce it, of course, you can play around with it and choose your own setting. Okay, and here's the delete. So what it does is it just deletes the lower portion of the geometry, and then I zero that out, and you see I have some intersections here, but because of the volume transfer type that I used, it won't be too much of a problem. Then I apply the secondary displace, and as you can see, it kind of shifts the whole band. And if I would do this before, I would actually get those curves and intersections kind of everywhere, and it's not what we want. That's why I solved it this way. There's another preview for the band. So that's the Displace. Then I clean up the attributes because I don't want to carry everything with me. So the next one is important because it compensates UV distortions. What happens is in UV space the points get evenly distributed, but in the object space they're not evenly distributed. They are much closer together at the edges. So this node actually takes the UV values and compensates for that and rewrites them in evenly distributed way. So if you have some maps applied to it, and that's what we're going to do later on, they don't have those high distortions towards the edges. And then we have the most important part, which is the brightness noise. It's a VOP sub as the distortions, and it contains similar nodes except for the sinus, of course, but it contains a noise function. It pulls out time, applies an offset, and everything that we've seen before. So it basically has 3 dimensions along the curve, then across the curve, all from 0 to 1, and then one that goes through from the bottom to the top in the y direction. And they all are collected as floating attributes and then get fed into a float to vector node, and that actually feeds into the turbulent noise position. So so I use the width to normalize the values, and then I add a constant because of the way the polywire works, and because I cut it in half, the UV values are off center, so I just bring them to a good symmetrical position, and then I have my noise attributes for the side, and that's how I set those bands. So there's a multiply and there's an offset. Then I have the parameters along the curve down here. So that's running along the curve, and this one's passing through, and all those get fed into a turbulent noise. You can set the noise type, and I didn't promote those parameters, but if you recreate it, feel free to do that. And also here's my frequency settings. Then I have this energy attribute that I kind of feed into everything as a multiply, and then I write it out once to the color values and also to attribute brightness A. There was supposed to be a brightness B because I thought like, okay, maybe we can layer stuff and have one smooth version and then one sparkly version, but I found that things get pretty complicated if you double all the settings. So the best idea is really to just create one volume with your basic settings for the smoother parts, and then change it, create some more high frequency noise and put it on top of everything. And yeah, here's my side ramp. So let's just go over it again so you can see everything. Those are distorting the UVs. Okay, and then here I normalize the brightness with the width. That's the one toggle that I shown earlier. And the next node, because sometimes you have brightness values that are lower than 0, if you keep them in the volume, that can create artifacts in rendering. So I clamp the values at 0. And I kind of, from this point on, The brightness for the volumes and the brightness for the preview are treated a little bit differently because the volume values are much dimmer and you still want to see something, so this that. Here's the two nodes for caching and a switch, and that's where I pick up the band stage. That, by the way, you can also, in this version, you can also render it out. Here's a switch, or export it if you want to feed that into a volume light. Then I extrude everything out, and that way you kind of get a extruded volumetric point cloud. So we had 2 dimensions, now we add just a third. Yeah. So here's the geometry, and it's not only on the outside, but as you can see, also on the inside. I was trying different versions with something grid-like and then just deleting all points below a certain value, and that would always get me into trouble in rendering the volumes, so I use this version. So here I create kind of, this is where I created cross-section for previewing, so I delete some parts, then I do the extrude, then I isolate things, and then there's kind of the same stuff running through that I have here. So this is for isolating the points, so I erase all the edges, and that way you can actually see all the points and also the brightnesses, but it's not as good of a preview as the band stage that I put in. But just because the outer parts of course occlude the inner parts, and if they're black there's nothing to see. This is my height-based gradient, so not a lot of magic here, and there's still some old parameters and things that are left out for later development. Yeah, so I create the brightness attribute, and then I apply a tint with 3 different ramps for red, green and blue. And then there's a height scale. That's actually a noise that will shift the upper corner of our volume. I might be able to show that. Yeah. So you have a minimum value that sets like the lower end, and then the maximum value that sets the higher end of the noise. And also there's a height shift here, and what it does is it shifts the baseline basically. And if you're aiming for a realistic effect, you should definitely play around with those values. They have great effect on the plausibility. Okay, so here's again some preparation for preview stages. Then I combine the RGB values, and yeah, I clean the attributes. Here I use some blurring parameters, set some blurring parameters, and also p-scale. What the p-scale is needed for is the VDB from particles. I tried different methods to create volumes from the geometry, and I found out that most of those methods would involve very strong aliasing, I tried a sphere running through the volume and just convert the geometry. And in some cases, you would really see the volumes flip on and off. With VDB from particles, it gets interpolated, so your particles basically become spheres. And if there's only a fraction of the sphere intersecting with the voxel, then you only have a fractional value, and so that's much smoother, and it wouldn't work otherwise, I think. And if you skip all the blur parts, this is just simple stuff. It creates a fog VDB for density, and it also creates a VDB for the color. And point radius scale is based on the voxel size. One short note on voxel size: if your particle distance plus the particle size is bigger than one voxel, you get gaps in between, and you'll clearly see them because they have like those even gaps, and then it's not coming from the noise. And you can use this to blur things out if you like, and if you have too much detail and want something smoother. Yeah, so I create that. Here's one node for atmospheric noise. And then there's a material, and then I just feed it out here into the render view and into the export geometry. And then if you dive into the MatNet, there's just a simple volume material that picks up the color value, and that's it. I promised to get back to the Discrete Fourier part. And there's a good video about epicycles and Discrete Fourier by Junichiro Horikawa. Arigato gozaimasu. And I won't be showing all the details about this, and I'll probably put the link on my page once I find it again. But what that does is... so here's my cat for testing purposes. Imagine you have a planetary system. You have the sun somewhere in the middle, then comes the Earth, then comes the moon, and then imagine there's a satellite around the moon. And they all kind of revolve around each other. And then imagine that the satellite was to trace a line. Now, with a simple system like that, you get probably like some kind of spiral-like look. But once you increase the number of things that revolve around each other by carefully setting the speed and the amplitude of the orbits, you can kind of recreate any kind of shape. And that's exactly what the Discrete Fourier transform does. It creates orbits for this curve. So if I lower this and say like 5, suddenly we get kind of a different shape. And I can dive in here. Let's edit that. And I have clean attributes, for example. By size offset epicycles. There you go. And then yeah, so those are the centers of the different orbits. And I don't have circles attached to them because it's not useful here. But let's get the numbers. So yeah, that's our 0. That's like the biggest circle, and then the one rotates around that, and then the second, and everything rotates around each other, and the last one actually draws the curve. Now what I can do is I can offset those epicycles, and with that I kind of shift the frequencies that compose this shape. So let's go back here, and set this to back to 50, and we actually need to display that flag back here. Okay, so I talked earlier about creating kind of independent modules that just have an input and an output, and the segment value is not connected to the segmentization of the Aurora band itself. It's just one step before that, and then there's another resampling going on. What that offset does is, if I would set this all to 0.5, so that's my middle, and then I go offset. Oh, I actually had to delete those were still connected. So let's say I have this offset, and then I can shift the different epicycle frequencies and actually deform my shape. And then slowly, so I have something very organic here. And there will be intersections and everything, but if you're careful, maybe you can avoid them. And this will only work with a closed curve because of the way they calculate it. But you can actually use the cropping and just create a closed curve and then use cropping to go around it. And let's say 2, and then I fade this back, and suddenly there's my cat. And just by shifting those values, I can just shift the shape around as I like and just try to find my proper settings. And to the left you have the smaller frequencies, so they won't make that much of a difference, but those will, as you see, they have more this shifting, rotating overall aspect. And also I excluded 2 parameters, which is the primary offset, which is rotates everything kind of. And you could use that for an effect that's not a Aurora, like have some kind of energy revolving around something, or a core or whatsoever. Use it any way you like. And the secondary, that's a little bit more squashing, deforming, but still on a pretty high amplitude. So the way I would use this is you create your offset, copy that parameter, say offset relative references, and here, and then with the speed you can say how much do those come in the effect when you use your offset, and that should really be just a tiny bit, maybe like this. Oh, okay. So, and with all the cat deforming and squashing, by all means, I love my cat to bits, so please don't go and call Peter or Greenpeace for me or anything. Or do call them and ask them for their funding account. Okay. So this is obviously a little bit more experimental, but there might be some cases where you can use it properly. Yeah, I think that's it. Just at the end, some ideas about how to approach effects like that. So first of all, I think it's always worth looking into visual phenomena. I remember, like back at German Film School, which is where I studied, we had a class with John Nelson, who got an Academy Award for his work on Gladiator back then. And he said that the field where things grow the most in visual effects will be natural phenomena. And that was actually the reason why I went further into that field and became a TD. And back then I was a lot into simulations and different algorithms, and I kind of wanted to do everything by the book, which is like physically correct. And for a while there's always been something missing, and that changed dramatically when I went into a masterclass with Joseph Gilliand, who's the author of an absolutely amazing book on 2D animation, 2D effects animation. He was working in the effects department on Disney as a supervisor for quite a long time. And he said that if you take something that follows physical laws and make it seem like it has its own intention, then you create magic. And so things became a lot more about art direction for me. And he has this interesting way of creating a punchiness in animation, and just first looking at where the energy is going, and sometimes taking away frames to increase the effect. And so a lot of things I've done changed into the direction of making it art directable and getting more control and leaving out some of the simulation parts. And as I said in the beginning, we need tighter connections between the cause and the effect if you want to have something art directable. The other story is, I don't remember who told me that. It was also one of my teachers back then. He worked at Lord of the Rings, and they had this scene in the Mines of Moria with the Balrog, where they created a fire simulation, and that was very early on. In terms of really hyper-realistic simulations. I remember, like back then, one of the first books that I read on the topic came out by Ronald Fetke about particle level sets and Pyre simulations and everything, but it was still, it wasn't something that was thoroughly tested and that a lot of studios had experience with, or that was available for smaller studios even. And they worked almost half a year on the physical simulation of fire, and when they applied it to the Balrog, it will be extinguished after a couple of seconds. And the reason was that the physical laws would not allow a fire of that size to be sustained for a longer period of time. It wouldn't work with the settings. The fuel would run out too fast. It would rather create some kind of big explosion. And so they put the whole system aside and did it with particles, just old school sprite particles. And I mean, that scene is amazing. And I'm pretty sure it would have been very difficult to tweak it to the effect that they wanted to have back then with long simulation times and everything. So those are just two stories that always pop up in my head when I'm figuring out how to do effect properly. So I already talked about like my approach and kind of the different stages in development during the asset, but I'll repeat it here and add on a couple of things because I think it's so important, and there was so many information that maybe that kind of got lost on the way. But if you want to skip it, it's about 2 minutes long. When I start natural phenomena, I kind of break the construction of the asset up in different phases with different objectives, and mostly I try to solve them in the following order, but sometimes I jump back and forth, of course. I try to find tools and algorithms that imitate the phenomenon, and in this case it's mostly done by laying noises over each other for brightness, displacement and such. And that's pretty straightforward, I think. And then I try to take technical obstacles. So that has to do with, okay, what kind of geometry I use, how do I do conversions, how do I get my curvatures and everything, and solving intersections and such. That would interfere with the imitation. So I try to solve things that are visible in my final rendering. Then I try to go towards art direction, try to find the most practical points of interaction, and things that art director would usually look for on animator. So frequencies, brightness, those types of offsets, different types of motions, and also old school animation, transforms and everything. And then there's performance optimization. So I try to find any tools in the toolset of Houdini that make the interaction faster, and I try to kind of layer my effect. So I have something on the basis that I can use to drive the more complex parts, which is basically what I've done here with those display stages. And try to have something that works in real time and gives you an idea of what the output's gonna look like. And this is a lot about flow. If you're not familiar with the term, that was actually discovered by a psychologist, Csikszentmihalyi, and he said like that flow is kind of the optimal experience and also optimal creativity, and you get that when you're above boredom and below distress. So when things are not too complicated to really capture them, when there's not too steep learning curve, and also there should be a connection as tight as possible between what you do and what comes out as a result. If you have something where you instantly get a feedback, then you can get into flow. Imagine a pianist, and I tried that with sound equipment that has a certain latency. Imagine a pianist playing and the sound comes after minutes or even hours. That won't work. You know, you won't get any kind of flow, you won't get rhythm or anything like that. You need an instant feedback. And it's all about creating closest interaction you can have to begin with and start diving into something, and then you go from there. Okay, so that being said, I will close this tutorial session. That was actually my first ever tutorial, so please give me feedback how you liked it, what I could do differently, and if you have any results using the Aurora or building your own asset or suggestions, feel free to contact me. If you want to share your results, I'll create a little gallery, and if you mail me some footage or stills, I'll be sure to link you and your social media accounts if you have any. This is not a one-time publish asset that I'll never touch again. I'll probably get back to this every now and then and try to expand the features. And if you work on a production and you want to use this and want me to customize it right now or in the near future, feel free to contact me. Also, I just got back from paternity leave, which is a thing that exists for a couple of years in Germany. I think it's rare in other countries, so I hope that expands as well, because it's just great getting to spend time with your kid and still being paid for it. So I'm searching for jobs, but until the little one is in kindergarten in September, I only work remotely. And I'm definitely up for any kind of teaching jobs because I really love like giving knowledge to the next generation of visual effects artists. And that is kind of a thing that I've been wanting to do for a while. And this is one of the first attempts to explore the possibilities there. That's it for today. Thank you for watching. My name is Christian Griese. Be sure to visit my homepage and also my Instagram account found in the link below. And if you like, then subscribe my channel. There'll be plenty of new tutorials coming soon.